Cool. Welcome back, everyone, to the live stream and everyone who's in the room right now. Our second session of the afternoon is Fighting Tenant Harassment with Open Data. It's a primer on what tenant harassment is, some of the work that's currently being done, and how you can join the fight. Please welcome our speakers, Dan from JustFix.nyc, Carly and Alex from the Mayor's Public Engagement Unit, Lucy from ANHD, and Abe from CAMBA HomeBase. As a reminder to our attendees who are in the room, if you want to submit questions and remain anonymous, and those online, please go to slido.com and use the hashtag NYCSOData. Dan and Carly, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for being here today. We're really excited. This is meant to be just a general overview of both the world as we see it in our day-to-day work, as well as the things that we're really excited about at the moment in the world of open data. So, Carly, I hand it over to you.
Awesome, thanks. So to give some primer of what is housing data and like kind of what the main housing issues are, we usually kind of think about things in terms of two types of main questions. So the one being about, can I find an affordable place to live? And the other one about like, am I at risk of losing my current housing? So while most of us do the first question as well, this panel is mostly about that second question, isolating it to, if I have housing already, am I at risk of losing it? So from 2010 to 2017, in New York City, rent was twice as fast as wages. And that also corresponds to over half of people in the city being rent burdened, and then 1 in 3 being severely rent burdened. So that means that they paid more than 50% of their income in rent. So one of the biggest checks against this in terms of keeping housing is rent-stabilized units. And so that means that when you have a rent-stabilized unit, they can only increase rent by a small amount each year. And then when a tenant leaves, then the landlord can then increase it by 20%. Once it hits a certain amount, right now it is $2,744.76, it now becomes an unregulated unit. That now means that they can increase the rent limit at any point, not at any point, any time in the lease, at any amount that they want. And that means that they also have less protections for the tenants that live in those units.
Great. So yeah, and as Carly was saying, the sort of term that we have for this in the sort of housing policy context is called vacancy decontrol. And we see this as one loophole of many in our current rent system that really incentivizes displacement in the current sort of context of the subsidized housing market. So, leading into sort of what tenant harassment is and what it looks like is oftentimes it can be both explicit activity as well as sort of implicit activity, like something like neglect, where the landlord has a clear financial incentive for tenants who are typically paying less or paying what is more affordable to them in their livelihood, are incentivized to displace those tenants for the sake of conversions, deregulation, and higher rates of affordability. Simply, they can make more money with more affluent tenants. And we see this at JustFix in sort of two key categories in terms of displacement. We see what happens formally through the housing court system in terms of evictions, and oftentimes evictions that might be frivolous or wrongful. It's not as simple as a narrative as the tenant simply can't pay the rent. Oftentimes, they might be withholding their rent from a severe lack of services. The landlord might just be more knowing that by sending a tenant to housing court, that's so burdensome and prohibitive of a process that they're going to get what's called a default judgment. The tenant might not be able to take off from work to go to housing court, and they're going to lose the apartment anyway without even getting their fair day in court. Sort of the other half of this equation, which was what we call the informal tactics of harassment, is driven by a lot of the work that we see in our daily practice of how we are trying to identify this through data. So we've heard, at JustFix, we've worked with over 10,000 individuals over the past 3 years who are experiencing or reporting these types of landlord harassment tactics. And this can be something as severe as repeated lack of heat in the wintertime. It can be structural defects, pest infestations, mold issues that they are simply allowing to happen or they're not proactively addressing in the context of the tenants living in this rent-regulated housing. It's really a large number of issues that also equate to the identity of where the tenants are coming from. So this is a huge issue in immigrant communities. We hear firsthand all the time from tenants who say their landlord threatens to call ICE on them if they try to enforce their rights, bring the landlord to housing court. Harassment is a very severe issue, and it's one of the main reasons why we're losing affordable housing here in New York. And it goes without saying, or it should go without saying, that this is something that disproportionately is affecting communities of color, long-standing multi-generational neighborhoods and gentrifying areas, and folks who are non-native English speakers, who it's even more difficult for them to know how to report these issues or fight back against them. And we see this on both this very individual level of what is preventing an individual, a parent or a family from getting just to have a stable sort of livelihood here in the city, as well as on a macro level. This is how gentrification happens. This is how we're losing affordable housing here in New York. So with all that in mind, we're going to talk about what we're doing about it.
Yeah, so how are we trying to fight it? What are we getting to the point? So we all up in, I am the director of the Public Engagement Unit Data and Analytics team, and I have Alex with me, who's a data analyst, and we're also with JustFix.nyc and ANHD and CAMBA, and all of us, even though we have some of us in the public and some of us in the private, we're all kind of trying to achieve the same goal of proactive outreach to prevent tenant harassment, or fight against it. So a little bit about Public Engagement Unit. So we are big on meeting people where they are, not waiting for them. What that means for me is that I come from a background of I worked as a legislative aide for a state representative in Massachusetts, and I spent a lot of time doing constituent services of exactly that. We did outreach to some extent, but a lot of the typical type of constituent services is waiting for people to come to you and doing what you can to help them. So I love what we do at the Public Engagement Unit, because we actually go out and find the people that don't need, maybe they don't know what is available to them. They might be disgruntled from government in the past, and we actually seek them out and see what we can do to help them. And we mostly focus on healthcare, civic engagement, and housing and homelessness prevention. And so I'll turn to Alex. Alex does most of our tenant support unit work.
Thanks, Carly. So I am the analyst for the tenant support unit that helps. So I help organize all the outreach data that we do collect and all the information that we get on various housing issues that we find. So with the tenant support unit, we are able to work in 20 different zip codes around the city in all 5 boroughs, and we've kind of narrowed down our universe of buildings and people that we think are most able to benefit from our help to among these 7,000 plus buildings that have at least one rent stabilized unit inside of that building. And therefore, in all of those buildings, we found that there are almost 150,000 units in those buildings. So as the tenant support unit, our model is to proactively go out and reach them, which involves having specialists go door-to-door canvassing, knocking on the door, speaking with as many tenants as possible, to then, it's fine, to find as many people who are facing these types of harassment, where the landlord is trying to convince these people to leave the building so that they can flip over the rent-stabilized building and to eventually become a market rent building. So we use a lot of different data in order to kind of create this universe for us to reach out to, but then we also create a lot of data just from the outreach that we do and the cases that we find of people experiencing these issues, and then the outcomes that we find from after working with them for periods of weeks, spreading all the way up to over a year and a half of working with these people who are facing various issues from fake evictions, real evictions, repair issues, being eligible for vouchers. So the first half of what we do is finding these people, and the second half is really that they're become caseworkers and social services workers, connecting them to city services that they're eligible for that they may not know they're eligible for. Some people don't know that they're in a rent-stabilized building, and they're able to then request to see, do I have these rights by living in a rent-stabilized unit, and building from there to make sure that they get all the eligible services all the services they are eligible for, and know all the rights that they have by living in this unit. So we build kind of our universe based on address data, 311 requests we look at fairly often because people are able to, independent of us, report that they're having housing issues. So when we see there's a spike of 311 requests in various neighborhoods or buildings, we make sure to go to those buildings as well. Census data, very helpful for any sort of demographic information across all of these neighborhoods, as well as the DHCR list of buildings with a rent-stabilized unit. So the state manages this list of all the buildings in the city and the state as well that have a rent-stabilized unit in it. They don't publish which units they are, but they publish which building has a unit in it. But then on the flip side, we also create and collect all this various data, including, did someone talk to us at this door? Are they facing any of these issues? And once they they decide to work with us, we help them submit 311 requests, which go over to HPD, and there's all these various tracking codes and numbers related to all those, and it really helps when building a case against a landlord to have all of these requests with HPD or 311 or any of these city services to build the best legal case to then prevent whatever harassment's going on or to prevent further harassment in that building. So again, with outreach, a lot of our public data we build into this canvassing tool that we've custom built to outreach to all these buildings inside New York City, and then also streamline that straight into case management so we know where all these problems are across the city. So if you're familiar with political canvassing for campaigns, it's a very similar tool where we cut turf every day. Or not every day, but we cut turf. Specialists go to these buildings. Some buildings are hundreds of units, some are just 7 units. So we make sure we try to hit as many as we can. And in the end, we try to help as many New Yorkers as we can. So if you're facing any harassment, feel free to contact us or dial 311 to report any issues. And questions about how we work, welcome to take them after the end of the presentation.
Perfect. It's exactly 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Thanks. Great. So I'll talk a little bit about the work that we do at JustFix.nyc. We are an independent 501c3 nonprofit. We're actually a civic technology organization at our core. And we have sort of a dual focus. We provide a lot of services that tenants use directly to report these issues of harassment, to understand how to navigate some of the complex bureaucratic processes like getting an inspection from HPD or navigating the housing court process. But what I'm here to talk about today is the work that we do to support tenant advocacy organizations around the city. So we have a partnership network of about 40 different organizations that are usually doing on-the-ground tenant organizing work. And one of the biggest sort of data-related questions or informational questions that we've gotten over the years is sort of what you see here, which is, we'll be talking with a tenant organizer who's getting reports of harassment in a particular building where they're working with tenants, and they have this question, which is, how do I know what other buildings in that neighborhood might have the same bad actor landlord who might be doing some of the same things? How do I know what other buildings the landlord owns? So using the open data that we had available, we looked at this as a data question. Landlords typically register with shell companies, or like in a limited liability corporation, making them really hard to track. But through a lot of data analysis, we were able to find meaningful patterns that we could codify into building a tool for organizers. So it's called Who Owns What. You can access it by just going to whoownswhat.nyc. And pretty simply, you go to the site, you put in an address, and we will map out all of the other buildings that are going to be owner associated by the same landlord or management company. We're able to provide quick access to key data points in terms of what is the landlord's portfolio, what are sort of outstanding violations, evictions that have happened in the building over the past year. Understanding how that building might be losing these really crucial rent-stabilized apartments. All for to have an easy tool in hand that organizers can use as part of their daily practice. So it helps with identifying patterns of behavior. We have some organizers that are huge fans of Excel, and so we just make it really easy for them to export the data directly. That's an important feature. The way that which Who Owns What is being utilized. So it's been live for a little over half a year now. We've seen really great turnout in terms of a large range of different users. Organizers, policymakers, legal aid folks who are building class action sort of group cases with this. journalists who are using it for more in-depth investigative projects and media, as well as trying to coordinate with folks in the city to how they can use this tool in their practice as well for more proactive enforcement, more early intervention when coming to tenant harassment, as well as this concept of city-wide level organizing. We have tenants that come to us who are coming from opposite corners of the city, but are experiencing the same tactics of harassment from the same landlord. And it's really, really difficult, or has been previously, to be able to coordinate on a city-wide level in that sense. So what we're sort of focused on now, again, utilizing open data to have better proactive indicators of harassment, is looking at things like how ownership change can influence the quality or responsiveness to tenant complaints in a particular building. Looking at how bad landlords might be buying up clusters of portfolios based on geographic basis. So on the map you see on the right, those different colors actually represent different years that a particular landlord was making investments. So we know, oftentimes to preempt a potential rezoning, like what's happening up in Washington Heights, Inwood, those red dots on the map, that landlords can often do what's called speculative acquisition, where they know they can be making a lot more money if the tenants are getting displaced, so they're going to buy up these rent-regulated buildings. And we know that should be an indication that tenants could be likely to be getting harassed there, because it just doesn't make financial sense for the landlord to have bought these buildings for that price otherwise. And I apologize, it gets super wonky really quickly. And that's your cue. Hi,
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, speculation on rent-stabilized buildings is the worst. We've been working on that with JustFix a little bit. So my name is Lucy Block. I work at the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, also known as ANHD. I am a research and policy associate there. I've been there for a little over a year and a half, and the main project that I work on is called DAP, or the Displacement Alert Project, which I'll be talking about today. You can see the URL there. All of the DAP tools, except for the one that is not public, are available at displacementalert.org. And we've got some awesome hashtags there for you to look at. But let's go to the next slide. Now on the next slide, I'm remembering I was going to say who ANHD is. So ANHD is an umbrella organization for basically nonprofit affordable housing developers in the city. We have about 100 members, not only housing developers, also organizing groups. The criteria for membership is basically to be a neighborhood-based group that works on ensuring the right to housing for low-income, low-wealth communities of color in New York City. Also groups that work on equitable economic development, but really it's like stable neighborhoods and the right to live and thrive in New York City for communities that are historically marginalized. We've been around for about 40 years. This slide is to frame our work. So here's some, overall guiding questions that I have come up with that I think are critical to ask for anyone who's working on policy or data, really just like in the world of affordable housing, if you want to put it in quotation marks, affordable housing, like the right to housing. Who is most impacted by the problem? We've gotten into that already. How do the tenants who are most at risk of displacement experience harassment and displacement pressure on a day-to-day level? I think Dan got into that. I mean, you saw a picture of a cat wrapped up in blankets. Like, I think that's pretty demonstrative of actual experience. So backing up a little, and zooming out a little bit, what is the regulatory and policy context that leads to systematic displacement of already marginalized communities? So I could talk about this for hours, we don't have time, but in order to understand the problem, we have to look at the history of this policy, particularly at the state level, more recent history of everything the city's been doing to try to compensate for issues at the state level that have been around since the 90s and that people are fighting really hard right now to overcome with this current rent regulation fight. ANHD supports the Housing Justice for All campaign, which you can look up on the internet. And then the most important question, what are grassroots groups identifying as the root causes of displacement, and what are the necessary solutions? And then we build our data and technology from there. Here's the river of DAP. So you can see two big upstream parts of the river. On the top is this private sector that Dan was referencing. If we're worried about speculation, it happens at the highest level. Sorry, it actually starts with the government, so that's bank regulators. Then you have banks, then you have buyers or investors. Local government comes into the picture as well, and both of those kind of come to a head at the landlord level. We're focusing on private landlords. Obviously, the state can also be a landlord. Oh, I only have 2 minutes. I'm going to talk faster. Okay. You can see the rest of the picture. Dan, could you go to the next slide? Okay, here are our tools for the DAP project. You can see they intervene at different points of the river of DAP. Next slide. Okay, so here are 2 public interactive tools. DAP Map is very pretty. It's an online map. It was our original tool, and you can search by building. You can get links to a lot of agency websites, and it also has 4 risk layers. So we're really trying to identify, put data together in a way that indicates particularly high risk of tenant harassment or displacement at the property level. District reports are similar, but they're meant to be a really actionable tool for tenant organizers. So you can go to the next slide. Here's just like a little graphic animation of DAP at work. I recommend looking at it on a computer rather than a phone if possible. Let's just let it play through, because I think I have time for that. We'll let it loop. I'm very proud of having made a GIF animation, but you can see kind of searching for a building, clicking on the properties, you can change the risk layers. There's about 500 megabytes of data on Carto in this map. It's a lot. We have data for every single one of the 860-ish thousand properties in New York City. You can click on any property in the city and get something. So this is the tool for tenant organizers. This is the outreach tool. It's wonky. There's a lot of stuff in there. I recommend checking it out. It's split up into community districts, and you can look at data by month. It's a report that lists buildings, rent-stabilized buildings, that have a particularly high risk of displacement or harassment. We have 5 different risk indicators in the reports. And then just because I didn't put a slide in here, but what's next on our front, we actually have one of our contracted developers here, Kylan Zhang, who's in the audience, who's working on something called DAP Portal, which is going to be like way more sophisticated from a technological. I mean, I think this stuff is pretty cool that I had a big role in making, but we have like real coders working on a new thing that's going to be even better and come out in the next couple of months.
That's me. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Abe Solberg. I am the program analyst with CAMBA HomeBase, and HomeBase is a homelessness prevention program in all of New York City. It provides comprehensive case management services to folks who might be experiencing a housing crisis. One of the HomeBase rolled out in about 2004, and it's administered by different community-based organizations. So although it is a city program, I work for a community-based organization called CAMBA. We operate in most of Brooklyn and Staten Island. And I've been here for about 9 months, and one of the things that we try to do is, my position is trying to target our outreach. So I have got a bunch of transitions on this slide, Dan, so probably just keep them coming. So between 2007 and 2017, I'll tell you, all right, pause there for a minute. Let me catch up, and then we'll go it again. So the homeless, the shelter population skyrocketed by about 80% over 80%. I think it's 82% between 2007 and 2017, and that's for a majority of reasons. Some of which have to do with shelter eligibility, and some of which have to do with the way the housing stock has fluctuated in New York City. New York City, more than any other city in the country, by about 3 times, evicts 3 times the amount of people in New York than any other city in the country. Indianapolis is the second one. But that's still relatively rare. Only 1.6% of renters will have be evicted in a year in New York City. And that's not even in the top 150 for percentage-wise in large cities. So although we're evicting a ton of people, it's still finding a needle in a haystack. And to extend that a little bit, evictions only occur in less than 5% of residential buildings in New York. So it's still relatively very rare. Yeah, next slide, or next little note. What does that one say? Oh, and informal evictions are actually twice as common as formal evictions. So when Dan was talking earlier about going through the legal system, that's about 25% of forced moves, and about 50% of forced moves is informal. So that's when a landlord might tell you, you have to move, you're back on your rent, and if a tenant doesn't know their rights or kind of gets scared, then they will. And that's considered an eviction, but it's not legally carried out by the legal system. Next little dot. Cool. And then nearly 10% of all shelter entry comes from just 30 census tracts in New York. So this is disproportionately impacting a lot of communities of color, especially in Brooklyn and in Staten Island. And I think next slide. Oh, what does that say?
What did you just say?
Oh yeah, research suggests that the neighborhood you live in and that the actual building you live in is a predictive indicator. So HomeBase, CAMBA at least, we only have 3 outreach workers. So what we're trying to do is find those spots, and here, actually, yeah, next slide. So our goal is to identify the neighborhood and building level factors that actually allow us to predict displacement, to indicate displacement, and then next transition. Thank you. And then to try to effectively use machine learning to target those buildings. So to find those 5% of buildings and send our, like you said, cut turf, get to those buildings, knock on doors, educate people about their rights, and try to utilize our resources in the most effective way to get to the people who we really need to be impacting. So what we've done is we've built a machine learning model, which does not yet have a name, that's actually trying to predict risk across our service areas, which is that bit of Brooklyn and all of Staten Island. And we've compiled over 175 different variables, taking a lot of inspiration from the work Lucy's done with the Displacement Alert Project to get some of our indicators, using a lot of the work Dan has done with Who Owns What to figure out different owner profiles and assess those as risk. Maxwell's in the audience. He's been super helpful with a lot of the R code. So building off help of a ton of different people to put together this tool that then allows us to try to go ahead and predict risk and actually get to those buildings. So you can see how our risk profile kind of breaks down in Brooklyn, and that's every building that's registered as a multiple registration dwelling, so where someone's renting, basically. And we found a couple interesting things from this. One of the ones that I think is more fascinating is that larger owner profiles, so the stuff Dan's compiled with Who Owns What, are more predictive of displacement. So if an owner has 20 buildings, each one of those buildings is more likely to displacing someone than if an owner just has one building. And that tracks with a lot of what you'd hear about, over-leveraged landlords trying to get out everything they can from a unit, and also with what tenant organizers would tell you, saying, if the landlord's not in the community, they're more likely to just be displacing people. So some of the next steps for this are trying to build it out a little bit more. Right now, this is only set up for Brooklyn and for Staten Island. So one thing that we're working on is trying to make it accessible across a wide range of housing stock and actually be able to equip it with tenant organizers, have it be more practical throughout. We're also, in that vein, trying to get it to update automatically, so every time there's a new 311 violation, every time a new HPD violation goes in, we're able to track that and our algorithm changes a little bit. So that's kind of the next goal for that. The eviction prediction machine, I like that.
The eviction prevention machine.
Oh, prevention machine, I like that. Sorry, so there's, so that's kind of what the next steps for it are, and also trying to consider what indicates a legal eviction and an informal eviction. So how can we actually get there before and be getting to those twice as common informal evictions where we can really sometimes be of the most help. So yeah.
Speaking of collaboration.
And yeah, speaking of collaboration. So one thing that Dan, Lucy, and I are all part of is called the Housing Data Coalition. And we are a group of nonprofits and activists and organizers and individuals who are interested in preventing sort of an alternative vision for housing data. So whereas a lot of real estate is fueled by big data and speculative real estate, we want to present an alternative that will allow us to utilize data to actually keep people in their communities and fight for housing justice. So we've worked really well. You can see there's a gallery of our tools on the website. If you go to the website, different tools people have built in coordination with the Housing Data Coalition. Yeah, Lucy.
I was going to say, I feel like we owe a lot to BetaNYC in the origination of the Housing Data Coalition, which was 2 years ago. Just want to thank BetaNYC for that.
Cool. Great. So the last thing we'll sort of mention as part of the Housing Data Coalition, we wanted just to open up as much of the time for the session to sort of questions and discussion with you all as possible. But just as sort of a starting point, we got really excited about this presentation because this is some of the only opportunities that we have of us as sort of nonprofits to actually engage with folks from within the city around, what we have are essentially very shared practices. And one of the most exciting things about that we've been sort of developing at the Housing Data Coalition is also having better sort of lines of communication and a more streamlined sort of workflow with folks inside city who know the data, who have access to the data, who know the wonkiness to the data. And that's been something I think really exciting to grow as part of as a community, is that it not having this sort of siloed relationship between advocates in the city. Essentially, we have a shared mission of securing affordable housing, and there's not that many housing data nerds in the world, and so we figured it's best to sort of.
Like there's a surprising amount.
Yeah, more than we thought, but still not. Cool. So we wanted sort of just the first point of discussion. And then we really want to leave it open to you all, is just sort of, talking a little bit about some of the opportunities and, to be frank, challenges in how we can more closely coordinate our efforts. I don't know if anyone wants to kick it off.
Yeah, I think on the city side of things, I think it's thank you to the organizers for deciding to put us together. It's kind of cool that a lot of us just met today, and it's been a nice opportunity to actually start having some conversations about how we could potentially collaborate more. As an example, in talking about this presentation, we realized that a lot of our outreach specialists use the Who Owns What tool, and actually one of the outreach specialists, when I was telling her about this panel, was saying, I just found out about it recently, and I don't know how I did my job without it, and I use it all the time, I use it every day, and it's just it's this essential piece of my work. And so it's finally it's good to have a conversation with you and try to connect more about how more of our specialists could use it, or what the use cases would be.
Right, and for us, it's something that's so exciting to share. And sort of the reasoning why our work is entirely open source, it's entirely available. Our primary users for the Who Owns What tool are the tenant organizers that we work with, but just getting an understanding that, by leaving these tools open, we're allowing folks, from a large sort of cross-sector community to be able to take advantage of them as well.
Well, I now have a question for my co-panelists, because I just reached over and I said, wow, it'd be really interesting to see if there's overlap, how much overlap there is between the district reports and the buildings that Alex identifies. And you said you use the reports. So could you just do you copy and paste the website into an Excel document? How do you
Sometimes.
Do you use them?
So I do look at the displacement alert project fairly often when directing outreach of where should we go. We do try to hit everyone in our universe, which is pretty large across our 20 zip codes. But when I see something pop up of when I go to either the displacement alert project, or I just look at 311 and pull that information as well. It has been helpful just to see what, because you can export your stuff off Excel, into Excel. I don't know how I've done it then.
Copy and paste.
Yeah, copy and paste.
Works pretty well.
Yeah, so I've definitely done that then, just to see what fits into our zip code, because we are fairly limited geographically. We can't, cross the street to do outreach here if it leaves the zip code that we're able to work in. But if it matches with our geographic turf, then we definitely kind of put it into our outreach decision workflow.
Is it okay if I talk for a second about how we developed the reports and why we decided on the thresholds? Because I think it's relevant to the conversation. I had done a fellowship at Cypress Hills LDC for a year from 2016 to 2017 while I was in grad school. That was after they went through a neighborhood rezoning. It was the first of de Blasio's rezoned neighborhoods, and Cypress Hills is a very embedded community organization in that neighborhood. They saw an uptick in tenant harassment as soon as the rezoning announcement happened, and they don't have the highest percentage of rent stabilized. It's a lot of smaller houses in that neighborhood. But it was a big problem, and so their tenant organizing department conceptualized this project. They wanted a grad student to build an early warning system using available data so that they could predict where tenants were at high risk of displacement. I worked there for a year, and then I just interviewed other organizers around the city to try to develop a tool after that would be applicable to across New York City neighborhoods. And we have a color coding system, so we have 5 different risk factors that are based on conversations with all those organizers, and then the properties are color coded, which you can see if you go on the website, if they meet multiple risk factors. And I've heard organizers say they just tend to go to the red, orange, or yellow properties first, and they tend to find a building that needs a tenant association.
Well, and I think both of you brought up something that we wanted to also call out as well, which is a massive challenge, and sort of in the interest of hashtag keeping it real. Which is, sort of these questions around turf. Right now we're sort of illustrating a lot of programs that are doing outreach to tenants, and something that's a clear observation that I would ask my fellow panelists to speak to is, there's definitely times in which tenants are getting their door knocked on by a lot of different people from a lot of different places, and how we could potentially find opportunities around that.
There's someone in the room who can confirm that constituent service staff at council member offices will say, I do not know where to send tenants. If I send it to the CBO, the community-based organization, the group that's been around for 100 years, the group that's been around for 3 years, the volunteer group, or TSU.
So I think to the point of everyone is knocking on everyone's door, like it's a good problem to have in some respects, where it means that we're all sort of on the right page, it would indicate, if everyone's coming to the same door. I think where we have room to improve is trying to collaborate more in those outreach efforts, actually. I think we collaborate a lot in terms of, tool building, especially in talking methods, like with the HCC, and I know Alex and I had met one time to talk about machine learning earlier, like a long time ago in the process of doing this. But then once it comes to utilizing those tools, like how can we better, go out in the field, not just from behind the computers, but actually when we're out in the field, what can we do to be more effective there?
Can we have audience members who know them more about, like who do this, weigh in on this question?
If anyone feels like they are aching to speak to it, I don't see why not. I mean, this is pretty much as far as we came in terms of planning this thing out. So we'd love to start to gradually transition into hearing what you all have to think.
I just think that what we're talking about, ANHD is much more an organizing, advocacy, and policy organization than it is a data or tech organization, and we support all of our groups and have for decades in doing this work. I think, I'm kind of thinking about what the executive director would say right now. It's that the groups tend to have their terrain that they're used to operating in. That does not mean that things are rosy in every neighborhood. That also doesn't mean that every neighborhood is covered by strong tenant organizing groups, because it absolutely is not. There are big gaps all over the city. What we're talking about is an issue more in some places than others, and it's an issue that can be aggravated by the city allocating money for more outreach without figuring out, what the current landscape is of organizing, and without consulting with the groups that have been there for decades.
And we'd just love to hold space for our friends within the city and how they would see this as well.
Yeah, I definitely think that, in terms of the zip code limitation, we definitely want to, have an effort to hit all of the doors, just in terms of thinking about, equity of, okay, if we prioritize one building, then we're leaving out another potential building. And I think, we've definitely run into that a lot of, I think what Abe was speaking to with his coming up with the model. We, in terms of, us kind of thinking through potentially if we would use a model to do outreach targeting, it's, even, geographically by borough, we have teams that work in each borough, and how do we make sure that model is prioritizing within each borough? Because otherwise, it might just only be in Wood right now because of the rezoning, and so I think definitely that's a thing we're thinking through, but also kind of limited to the zip codes. And do you have something else to say about the zip codes?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay.
Yeah, we do get cases coming from outside of our zip codes when just agencies refer people who are facing harassment to us, and we'll take it on. But part of the reason why that we are limited to these zip codes is that there is city funding for legal support for people facing harassment in these zip codes that we can connect them to. And cases that are outside of these zip codes, we can't give them as much support as we can for cases inside of the 20 zip codes I had on the map earlier.
And we have a question.
Well, a question or a comment. You asked about how to get the community more involved. I'm here, I'm Rich Mintz on behalf of Manhattan Community Board 6. We are a pretty activist community board on this issue. I'm on the housing committee, and our district manager and assistant district manager trained us all on these tools, so I'm familiar with all this stuff. I'm wondering if one of the ways to increase the leverage is to go through the community boards to empower, teach, and train those people. And if you've done that, what kind of response you've had?
Yes and no. I think it depends on the community board. I think it is pretty publicly agreed upon that every community board is different, that there's a total unevenness across the city in the amount of capacity, expertise, and representation that each community board has for its district. I did a presentation to the Housing Committee in East Harlem. I presented to all the Manhattan borough. I mean, Gail Brewer is amazing and supports all of this work. I got to present to Manhattan district managers, and I also presented in Brooklyn. There are just limits to the interest, I think. And that's because community board members are volunteers. They're expected to do a million things. And it, what we're talking about today is more of a problem in some neighborhoods than others. Some neighborhoods I live in Elmhurst, it's a pretty stable neighborhood, for example.
And for us, if you asked this question on Wednesday, I would say, we just talked to the Brooklyn Borough Board, because we're doing that on Tuesday. But I think one of the more complicated issues, not just in training these things, is the way people talk about them is a big one. Like, in order to get people to really effectively use these tools and leverage them, there's housing, like Dan said earlier, is obviously super, super complicated and wonky. And so, like, being able to try to articulate a vision where everyone's on the same page, where, supportive housing units for folks who are just leaving shelter aren't combating affordable housing units in a community, because these are, one side of the same coin, but people don't necessarily see it that way. Extending rent stabilization conversations to also all affordable housing conversations, because those are not necessarily the same thing, although they are really important. And I think some of those issues almost can be intimidating in a way that prevents people from necessarily being able to get fully into it, if that makes sense.
I think we have so much room to grow in terms of linking the issues of homelessness and our affordable housing crisis in the world that we operate in, and also in thinking about public housing as being part of our city's housing system. It's 400,000 people out of 8 million, about a 20th of the city lives in public housing, and because of the different regulatory structures, different data structures, we pretend as if it's like a different city, like NYCHA is a different city. It's not, it's the same friggin' city.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the presentation. It's been really interesting. I had 2 quick questions. It's a really hot mic. The first one is, so you all mentioned having multiple organizations, agencies, people get to people's doors. How would you describe the differences in tactics and approach of each of those different people who are getting to the door, right? So there's going to be some groups that are more confrontational, some more legal, some more service focused, some that are building towards a social movement. What are the differences between your approaches, and what do you think is most effective? Which might be a reason why you might want some to get there first, or not, depending on your political views. And then the second thing I wanted to ask is just how do you think about, there's the discussion of in large part putting the data into a database that's accessible and open as a positive thing. I think that's absolutely, undoubtedly true. I think I'm from LA, and there's been a lot of discussion from advocates in the city around rent stabilized units there. And one of the repercussions that people were thinking about was, would this accelerate the market in terms of not only people using to defend themselves, but also landlords, real estate agents who may not have access to huge databases, but also potentially incorporating their own decision-making process. So could you talk a little bit about that process of deciding how to govern that data, how to release that data, how it might affect or accelerate the market? Yeah,
it's a really great question. So I'll speak briefly on 2 of those fronts, and then see what.
That's enough for us to go for the next 15 minutes. So let's try to keep it to 5.
Yeah. On the first one, this was something that we really wanted to sort of call out, having this opportunity to speak together, because it's something that we hear directly from a lot of organizers, especially given that TSU is sort of relatively new, it's only been in the past couple years, that the city has been doing more proactive outreach to tenants who are facing harassment. And one of the prevailing things that we hear a lot from organizers is just wait, what's going on? Where are they working? What are they doing? And so I think it's just, even on very basic levels, just having shared understanding of the different strategies, because, we acknowledge that organizers are really focused on building collective power and focused on root cause issues of how, loopholes in our rent laws are allowing, incentivizing this harassment on the hands of bad landlords, and building stronger tenant associations, and doing things that really get at the root of from a larger issue. And I'm sure that the TSU folks would also say that their focus is on really providing immediate aid, which is also critical in a lot of these situations. They can speak to it better. On the second sort of part, that's something that has been really, really fascinating about our work at the Housing Data Coalition. All of the work that we're doing is built on top of pre-existing open data sets. And the value that we're adding is we're finding shared practices to bring a lot of disparate data together. So our databases are using 12 different data sets from 6 different agencies, both city level, state level. Each one has its own way that it codifies and identifies different buildings and stuff like that. And so there's a lot of value being added to our work in just creating a simple place for folks to access data. But it's actually really posed really interesting questions among the Housing Data Coalition around how open source policies can potentially allow the same sort of value to be used on a speculative side. We don't have a clear answer for that. Part of it is kind of going back to the roots of open source ideology, which is saying who owns what. Being open source increases its credibility. You can see how we did our math. You can see how we mapped out these landlords based on shell companies, and we think that there's power in that. The last thing I'll mention is the point that is running away from my brain that I'm forgetting about, which is, just how we see our work as being trying to counteract what is a multi-million-dollar real estate tech industry that uses this open data, gets venture capital funding to build tools like Property Shark being one of the biggest examples, and that our tools are really just opening up that access in an already unequal sort of dynamic where tenant groups just haven't been able to have that previously.
I'd like to echo that. I agree with that. I see the collaboration of HDC as being our counteracting force to what Dan is describing. I'll say that every organization that's involved in HDC builds its own tools on top of the data infrastructure and makes its own decisions about how public to make everything, because of exactly this concern that any data that can be used to build tenant power and tenant associations can be used to speculate on the property and get those tenants out of their buildings. So it is a real concern. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything onto that, but on the other question of different tactics that get used, I have things to say about it, but I'd be really curious to hear from TSU and maybe even Abe before talk.
Yeah, I think it's you definitely touched upon kind of 2 separate points that I think all kind of wanted to hit anyways, so thank you. So I think with how we're different, I think having it funded by the city is a sustainable way of making sure that this work is funded and that we have the resources to do it. And so I find that to be a super powerful thing about the city taking on the work. And in terms of how we actually do outreach, I think I am probably not the best one to speak to it because I'm the data person and not the one in the field. But I think we do kind of take a lot of the same approaches, and it's kind of interesting, the way that you bring up the same people hitting the same doors. I come from political campaigns, and it's always we have that issue, but we can't solve it because you can't legally coordinate. And so it's kind of interesting to think about that same problem existing with all of us potentially hitting the same people. In terms of the open data question, we were kind of all talking about that. I think there's also I told Mitsue in the back from Moda that I was going to give her a shout out for this. I think it's also a misconception that we have all this extra data that other people don't have, that Housing Data Coalition doesn't have, and we kind of are constantly struggling to come up with getting more data within the city and data sharing agreements within the city. And so Mitsue has been amazing at Moda to try to kind of spearhead getting analysts to talk to each other and actually share more data within each other.
Wait, the tactics question. Did we get to that?
I was going to say, are there any more questions?
Yeah.
We didn't.
Does anyone else have, or we can keep talking?
Wait, no, I want to answer the question from before.
Okay.
Yeah. Outreach methods question?
Outreach methods, known in organizing sometimes as tactics, yes.
Yeah, I can speak a little on behalf of TSU's outreach methods. We mainly go through door-to-door canvassing. We also attend various housing events. When there is a tenants association in a building, we go to those meetings as well, or if we have enough cases, enough interest inside of that building, we start the tenants association inside of that building. We also attend, like office hours at any elected officials in our turf across the city, but we kind of stop there. We don't like advocate for anything else. We are the city, so we don't advocate for laws changing within the city. But we try to find problems and connect them to whatever solutions they are relatively immediately.
But I do think also, like, I do see, like, songs sitting in the back from the Access NYC project. Like, so TSU also ties into that, too. If anyone of you went to the Access NYC project, they have an eligibility screener to kind of think through what else in government you might be eligible for. So, like, when, like, TSU, like, a big thing that they do is, like, just kind of problem solving at the door to think about, like, how can I help you in any way? And they definitely try to be this, like, liaison to government of, like, we know that government has probably failed you, or, like, we know that you might have some kind of feelings either way about how government works for you, but we want to be this point of contact for you, and we want to help connect you in a way that's positive.
So I
want to open up for more questions. If
I'm gonna jump in.
you're gonna.
I appreciate you, Dan. I would describe that as a case management approach. Whenever a tenant is facing, stop laughing, please. Whenever a tenant is facing really dire problems, I think there's a question as to whether they should try to overcome those problems individually, or whether an organizing approach where they are joining together with their fellow tenants in their property or across the portfolio of their landlord's properties, or in group with another kind of larger tenant union makes more sense. That's an individual decision for a tenant. Some organizations are more likely to route an individual tenant directly to legal services or direct them, like having an advocate to call up HPD or DOB and yell at HPD or DOB on your behalf is very powerful for an individual tenant. ANHD supports capacity building for nonprofits that do organizing, so we support professional tenant organizers who tend to build tenant associations in a building, but they're always going to use a different strategy. Every organization is different, and ideally, a tenant association in a property level is a building block towards a larger campaign. So we have many organizations that are building tenant associations that are then engaging in the statewide fight to improve our rent laws. That's kind of the ideal scenario from ANHD's perspective.
Thank you. Other questions?
Thanks everyone for the panel. My question is around an additional data point that I wonder if any of you could shed some light on. You guys mentioned over-leveraged landlords as being a big driver of harassment. And I was curious if, and I know ANHD has done a lot of work on Signature Bank and other banks financing these unsustainable loans to landlords that are fueling displacement, and if there's a good place, sort of a clearinghouse for tracking those. I know UNHP has done some work on that, but I'd be curious to hear if there are other resources.
Yeah, this is sort of, what did someone, I think Benjamin called this, like it was a white whale problem, like getting an accurate data point on this sort of speculation question. So just for the non-housing nerds in the room, it's essentially getting an assessment of how much the building has been bought for and how much money is the building making, right? If the building has been bought for way more money than could be possibly made through the current rent-regulated rents, then that's speculative. Then that's saying, okay, there's a chance or it's a likelihood that it just doesn't make financial sense for the landlord to not sort of be getting the current tenants out of the building. So clearly this is a massive data problem to get a reliable estimate of that. We actually have been sort of coordinating as part of the Housing Data Coalition to get assessments from it, and I think some of the different strategies, even going into how we operate differently as organizations, is a concept of how precise do we really need to get. Can we get sort of napkin math, a level of saying, okay, this is obviously speculative, it's obviously not, versus really being able to get into it, because frankly, the Department of Finance themselves don't necessarily have really accurate numbers or understandings in terms of sale price and some of those other things.
ANHD favors what's called a gross rent multiplier, which is used in the real estate industry, and there's some standards. There's some consensus that it's like a factor that the gross rent multiplier, if it's over 11, then it's likely a speculative sale. So we've been using that as a basis for a lot of the work we've been doing in the last couple of years.
And for folks who are interested, not in the ANHD, but just more about that, there's a really wide body of academic literature on the financialization of housing, it's called, the way people have started treating property as an asset to make money from rather than as a property, and there's been some really good work there that they've tracked a lot of this.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot more to see pretty soon, actually, in the near term about just getting, we know that we're, especially on the Who Owns What tool, it's something that is really high on our to-do list. Cool. So we have about 5 minutes. I don't know if there's any final questions or comments. All right, so we got 2. Okay. 3. Oh.
Which one did you say?
I think.
I don't know. I'm not going to make that
I
determination.
think with I saw a hand. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, I'm actually working with Lucy, so I can also pass this on. If
How about let's collect all 3 questions, speak to
Okay.
them, and call it a day.
Yeah,
Thank
so in brief, I guess, in the process of working on this tool for ANHD, we've been talking to like city council staff, and as Lucy mentioned before, one of the questions I often have is like, what groups have already reached out to these tenants? And those are questions that we can't answer because, again, like someone else mentioned, groups have different tactics and don't always agree with each other. So one of the questions I wanted to ask is from a strategy point of view, like what is the benefit of also having like closed data, like in addition to the open data that you have, and what are the times when you need to protect users, and also what are the times when politically strategizing between organizations you need to be able to plot like away from the public eye, and how could that also be embedded in the open data tools that you guys are building? So yeah.
I am involved in a community-based planning project in Bushwick, Brooklyn, which is where I've lived for a long time. And one of the big concerns is secondary displacement because of new market rate housing. And there's a potential rezoning going on, so there's a huge amount of conversation about that. Does your data show that pretty clearly? And also, can you add that in as a sort of, as a risk factor as you color code different buildings?
Thanks. I think there's one in the back there.
Hi, I work for the Department of Social Services, and so I know that we definitely work at times with like HomeBase and with PEU as well. So I'm not always aware of all the things going on, but I'm curious whether you've explored the idea of incorporating social services data into your outreach protocol and things like that.
Case data?
Yeah, some case data. Like we know when benefits are ending for people, like public assistance, or if they have homelessness histories, things like that, that could show markers of vulnerability.
I would say the same thing. Data sharing. I would take any data I can get. Yeah.
Cool. So just to restate, we have the value and benefits of having closed data, and we're going to do this all in a minute. The value of closed data. By sort of second market rate,
Secondary
it's like
displacement
sort of
and
new
what?
luxury developments driving displacement, and using social services data.
We use some social services data. We get, because we're funded by the city, we get some city data. We also have looked into using the data that we collect in-house to help feed our model. Obviously, the more data, the better for this. All right, time's up, so everyone go through real fast.
I'm going to talk about secondary placement. There's a short answer. It's not perfectly and not in the way you wish it would. But I can talk to you more about that after.
Anything?
Yeah, and with closed data, obviously we all collect a lot of very personal, private information about all of our clients, and we can't really share any of that. But being able to share at some level, I don't know what that level is, to better coordinate where we are and what we're doing and how we're doing it, would be beneficial, but it is also difficult.
Please come find us. You have our emails now, and thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.